Hi, everyone. Does objective morality exist? Does morality and moral duties to do what's right, to do what's just, to do what's truthful, is that something that all humans are bound to, or is it merely a function of one's opinion? Well, in this video, we're going to attempt to answer that. The synagogue and I are a couple of Christians, and we got on to The Rage, which is a channel run by the Raging Atheist and John Peterson, and had a nice conversation today about these topics. So I'm going to highlight a couple of portions of this video, and I really hope that you'll enjoy it. And so stay tuned. I just want to define. So if we say objective moral values and duties, this is the idea that we have objective moral values and duties that are stance independent, meaning that they are axiomatic standards that don't vary as a function of any person's, culture's, or generation's opinion. And you can see those even played out in our Declaration of Independence, when our founding fathers said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And so I'll name a few objective values that I believe all humans we started to learn about, we discover in the human process of living: truth, justice, equity, love. And then we've come to realize the importance of equality of opportunities, thanks to Jesus Christ and his influence on the world. And I would say we also have this objective moral value to follow the golden rule. We've got a duty to follow the golden rule. And we see that played out in all of the major world religions. And even in, if you go to the American Atheists, and you look at their website, you're going to see that they've also endorsed that. Humanists endorse that deal. So I'll just say that if someone says that we don't have objective values to tell the truth, or a duty to tell the truth, or to be just or fair or loving, ask them what planet they're on, because they're certainly not on this planet, because on this planet, humans are innately aware of this, and it's something that's part of our conscience, thank God. In Romans 2:15 has made that clear. So I will pass it on to CJ.
And so one of the things that I would kind of say is I think that, the question of objective morality is obviously a very interesting one, because, of course, as soon as you answer the question of whether or not it can exist or does exist, then the question becomes which values are objective, and how is this thing grounded and all those sorts of things. And, from a strictly philosophical perspective, not necessarily getting theological quite yet, there are certain things which do seem like objectively they are shared not only as a moral, imperative for all human beings, but even for just living creatures. Like, for example, I just mentioned Schopenhauer. He had a very famous thing called the will to life, or the will to live. That seems to be an inherent thing valued by all living creatures, other than, I would say, like, some very minute exceptions, like, for example, suicidal humans. Like bees can get the colony to have a sort of like a kamikaze sort of thing, right? And those exceptions do typically have some kind of an explanation that doesn't actually come into conflict with the objective existence of the will to life. For example, in the case of those bees, it's usually for the protection of the hive and, more importantly, the protection of the queen bee. In the case of suicide, we are incredibly unique creatures that are capable of doing all sorts of things that are different from nature, including, having these depressing feelings and wanting to act on them. But all living creatures do seem to have innately from birth this will to live. And that even, by the way, does tend to include the suicidal. Lots of studies have shown that, like, once somebody does actually jump into that particular frame, right? Or like there's, for example, you pass the point of no return, so to speak, right? But somehow they manage to live. They usually do recall having intense feelings of regret during that small period of time when it looked like they were past the point of no return. So that seems to me to be something that is objectively shared, at least by all humans and potentially by all living creatures, right? This will to live, which would place some sort of a objective sanctity and objective value on life itself. Well, that could obviously, from that, we could postulate what different things would be in violation of that sanctity or value that is life. For example, a murder. For example, warfare, for example, the different things like that. And then people will start, building the different rules around there. Now, obviously, without getting too deep into that, because I know that people will have some questions, my immediate question personally is, okay, what does that matter? Frankly, I just tell you guys what I think of it for myself. Like, okay, all living creatures have the will to live. So what? That doesn't really, I guess it doesn't necessarily have an ultimate meaning. And that's where I start to see a necessity for the God claim, right? Because if all living creatures feel the necessity to live and it has no ultimate relevance, then, I mean, in the end, who cares? All volcanoes at some point explode. It doesn't really mean anything. They just do it. It's just the way things are. And if that's the only way it is, that it's just the way things are, then it seems to me that there is an objective fact, for example, the sanctity of life, that is going unexplained and existing for an utterly futile and pointless reason, if that makes any sense. And that's kind of where I'd drop that, because I want to get some, back and forth.
So, actually, with what you just said a moment ago, what you finished with, I would agree with that. Okay, and my the way that I explained where morals came from, where morality came from, has a lot to do with, you called it the will to live. I call it, and it's not, I didn't coin it, but well-being. Okay, everybody has a sense of well-being, and you mentioned too that it's not just humans that have that, but other species of animals have this innate, instinctual will to preserve their own lives. So you guys, both of you are saying, using the word objective. One thing I want to nail down before we move on any further, when you say it's objective, are you saying that it's independent of human minds?
I'm saying no, independent of human opinions or human stance. That's how they define it in the literature, the academic literature. So it's stance independent.
Okay. All right. So we have that. Now, when you say that an objective duty, okay, is that basically what you just described? That it's something that we all agree on, that we have a duty to do, regardless of anybody's opinion on the subject.
I like what going back to what CJ said, and just build on that he was talking about the idea that we should, life is something that we should want to continue living. Of course, some people do violate that, but it gets us to the value of life. For example, do you value life? Do we value human life? Do we feel like children should be valued and nurtured to grow and do that kind of thing? So we would say that the human condition and position is to value human life. Whether or not somebody follows that, that's another matter. So whether or not somebody believes in that is another matter. It says it stands independent of whether somebody is flawed. Just like if I say it's an ontological question. So if we have objective moral values and duties, we're questioning, do they exist? It doesn't matter whether Johnny understands them or Johnny interprets them correctly. Just like math exists, even if Johnny doesn't understand math or Johnny doesn't get math or something like that. But does it exist? Stands independent. And I would say it does. So it doesn't matter which culture you're coming from. We have this shared human condition that we're going to value life.
Well, and interesting, I would interestingly enough kind of build off of that. you know, it's weird that these independent cultures cross-culturally, they do actually tend to have a lot of the same values and duties. What tends to be different is interpretation. And to give you a very extreme example, both the United States of America right now and Nazi Germany believed murder was wrong. What they defined as murder was what came into question. And the Aztecs believed that as well, and the Assyrians believed that as well, and the Israelites believed that as well, and so on and so forth, right? And you can find that with almost all of the things that we generally assume are crimes. Or excuse me, I guess sin would be a better word, because crime, obviously, is based off of legal. But like theft, most people throughout most cultures have considered theft to be wrong, even if they don't necessarily agree on what theft is. Maybe theft is really only the more people-y people, and the peasants aren't actually, people who you can steal from. But notice that you're only changing the definition. You still agreed theft is wrong. Even rape, people often point to Augustus Caesar as the first actual rape law. That isn't actually true. It is true that the laws were structured in such a way that made it kind of almost a property law. But the laws did exist all the way back to Hammurabi. Not Hammurabi.
So I want to clarify a little bit on what he's saying. When he said about redefining murder, it's redefining who is murdered. So one of the things that the Nazis did during World War II, which is a real scam, is in their propaganda scheme, they would pretend that Jewish people were less than human, and they would run pictures of rats. And so how people justified that is that they were not taking another human's life. They were Aryans at that time, supposedly, in their heads. They were superior in that time. They had a ridiculously horrific situation going on in Nazi Germany. And the same thing happens today with people when they abort their babies. A lot of times people are told by the nurses that their babies are mere tissue or clumps of cells, or something like, you're going to terminate the pregnancy. They'll tell you that. So it's a real shame, because they tell people that because people have an innate sense that murdering another human is wrong. So to justify that, they've got to reclassify the human. Let's go on.
Hammurabi, a little bit after Hammurabi, about.
Well, hold on. Let me interrupt there, okay? Because actually, you're hitting on something I wanted to bring up, okay?
Well, and so I need to pipe in eventually.
Yeah. You say that there's these objective moral values that everybody can agree on. They're independent of opinion, okay? But what about, were they always that way? Okay, because when humankind started and we were closer to being animals than being human, okay, you mentioned rape. Well, in the beginning of mankind, when we were roaming around in groups like packs of animals, if a male wanted to have sex with a female, he would go over and grab her and have sex with her. And we now know to where we are in human life. And as you mentioned, we knew this long ago, that that's not morally right. Okay. And we came to stand against acting like that.
So what evidence do you have that a person was doing that in the distant past?
I mean, because of the way humanity started, we were closer to animals than actually people. I mean,
so he has zero evidence that the first humans were just going around raping one another. He has nothing in the archaeology. He has nothing in history. However, he's making these assertions based on assumptions that he held.
Because I know that you are a Christian that accepts evolution, but you also accept the fact that we all came, or you think that it's fact that we all came from Adam and Eve. Am I correct?
See, I accept evolution to an extent. If that's the method God used to bring us to this planet, and we certainly have evidence of intelligent design in our DNA and in other places, in the cell, the signature in the cell, which is a really good book, explains a lot of that. You can just look at DNA and you can realize that there has to be a coder behind those 3.5 billion organized A, T, C, and G characters. You wouldn't assume that the Bible had no author and all the words were just put together in perfect place in juxtaposition. So you shouldn't assume that the DNA, which is also put together and well ordered, is something that's not a function of a coder. Even Bill Gates has noted the code in DNA. Yes, I think we came from Adam and Eve. So what evidence do you have that, I mean, you're saying that at some point humans were raping and it was acceptable, but how do you have evidence for that? Do you have some sort of historical evidence or geological or archaeological or just evidence that supports that?
Well, yeah, because of the way the humankind developed. We were closer to apes than the modern humans that we became, the more enlightened and intelligent humans that we became. I mean,
but he doesn't have any evidence because the thing is, we're the Homo sapiens sapien. Okay, so we're not Homo erectus, we're not any of these other forms of animals. The first humans, Adam and Eve, were Homo sapiens sapiens. And so he has no evidence that the first Homo sapiens sapiens were busy raping each other. He's just making an assumption based on his proximity or the proximity in his mind to apes.
I mean, yes, I mean, it absolutely happened. I mean, could I point you to a source right now? No, but
no, I don't think you could, because I think if you're going back, you can show me an ape, and if an ape, certainly gorillas mate that way, they forcibly copulate. But I don't think we have any clear evidence that the first humans were over there forcibly copulating with one another and calling it copulation.
Well, and to kind of actually, I think, you know, from a perspective of the philosophy behind it, you know, I think you ask actually a very good question. I asked Negation of P a similar question as it pertains to eugenics and potentially weeding out things like physical and mental capabilities from the womb. Not capabilities, sorry, but physical and mental disabilities, excuse me. And the thing is I actually don't believe, and we ended up kind of hammering on this there, and I think you just kind of hinted to it now, it just in the reverse order, right? Going from the past to being more enlightened rather than going to a point where that might become something that you can do. Next. You know, I think that the worldview that you postulate has no real answer for why that would be wrong. Indeed, that moral would change at some point because it could potentially be beneficial. For example, if there is a abundance of females and a low number of males, and there is a low number of there's like not a lot of prosperity, like we're bestial, right? And it basically just operates a lot like apes do. Then yeah, potentially it would become biologically advantageous for us to forcefully copulate. So does that make it moral? I don't think that it does. I don't think that you could argue that it does. And just because an ape does it, or a lion does it, or a shark does it, I don't know if I don't think that would actually have a bearing on what we do.
Hold on, CJ. In no way was I trying to say that it would ever be right or that it was right back then. What I was pointing out is that we evolved as a species. And I mean, despite SJ's denial, it absolutely happened. I mean, just like you said.
Let me pipe in here because I really need to catch up into this conversation. There's been quite a bit said, and I kind of just want to catch up and nail down some points. So from SJ's original statement, she mentioned the founding fathers: truth, justice, equality, love. These things, you know, I would agree that these are things that we all aspire to have and inherently given by the Constitution. But the founding fathers, I wouldn't say that they believe that all people were equal.
Okay, so he's making a point, and I'm going to address each of his points because I really didn't have a chance to in the debate. So yes, he is agreeing that we have objective moral values and duties. So I'm really hats off to Raging Atheist for agreeing with that. Now, the next thing he's going to say is because the founding fathers didn't view everybody equally, even though they said all men are created equal, the founding fathers were pulling what we discussed a little bit earlier about people dehumanizing other people. So they had dehumanized the people they brought over here from Africa, obviously, and treated them in horrific ways. Thankfully, some Christians and abolitionists like Wilberforce were able to overcome some of the challenges that these people who were holding slaves had. And of course, we had a great president, Abraham Lincoln, who was able to get us out of slavery. And now we do realize it took a long time. It took till 1964 with Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, where we finally recognized that all humans truly are going to now be given equal rights in the workplace. So it took a long time. It took a really long time. But we do always discover our values. And I think that one of the things that's really great about humanity is we are constantly searching and discovering and doing all of those kind of things. And as each of us come onto this planet, that's what we do. So yes, the founding fathers did say all men are created equally. However, they weren't acting properly because they were only thinking of white men. They actually at that point weren't giving females any voting rights. And of course, they weren't giving blacks any voting rights or anything, or any rights at all for that matter.
because they certainly didn't establish that. It took us quite a while. Another statement was equality of opportunity thanks to Jesus Christ. And I would say that more.
I would highly recommend that you take a look at the verse that Paul said, neither slaves nor free, nor Greek nor Jew, everyone's equal in the eyes of God. And that particular view was a real game changer. Okay, you can go back and listen to Tom Dominion on a lot of videos. He's talked about this, and he's written a really good book called Dominion. Now, Tom Holland is an agnostic, although he does now identify himself as a cultural Christian. However, he's an agnostic, so he had a very objective look at history, and he noticed how Christianity has really impacted history in very positive ways. I could also recommend books by people like Alvin Schmidt, who's also written something on the historical value of Christianity. Or Joel Edmund Anderson, here's another one, another book on the historical value of Christianity.
I'm more thankful towards the activists that were active in those periods of time, demanding those, despite despite the power of the church that's always kind of ruled over this country. You mentioned the golden rule. While I agree that like the golden rule is decent, I think that it's a bit self-centered. I think a better way to look at life would be to do unto others what they show you to be right and what you know to be right. And only if those two things kind of collide. I think when you say do unto others as you would have them do unto you, then you're taking a very self-centered look at life, and you're basically demanding other people to succumb to what you perceive life to be or how people should be treated. And when it comes to CJ, you said the will to live since birth would be an objectively shared fact. And I would maintain that while, yes, I'm sure that some people that are suicidal do express gratitude that they didn't carry out those acts, plenty of people actually did. And so that will to survive doesn't seem to be objectively a fact at all, because people do actually commit suicide.
He somehow is still not getting what I was trying to make the point earlier. There's a difference between moral ontology and moral epistemology. Okay, so moral ontology is whether or not something exists. So whether or not the golden rule exists. Now, we took a look at 7 world religions. You can go by a study by Kinnear and colleagues from 2000, where they looked at 7 major world religions along with the United Nations and the humanists and the American atheists, and they identified that everyone had something equivalent to the golden rule. Now, you can look at the golden rule and say it's do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And if you don't like that rule, or you think that there's a better rule, that's not the point. The point is whether the rule exists. And in the Bible, we make specific, love your neighbor as yourself. You could also look at that as another form of the golden rule. And so the twisting of the golden rule, or if you can improve on the golden rule, that's not the question. How we came to know the golden rule, or if people follow it, again, that's not the question of its existence. I tried to hammer that down, but somehow that doesn't seem to be getting through. That's an epistemological position where you're looking at how people come to it. How do they come to understand, or how do they come to believe something? Okay, so whether or not, again, we have all of these people who follow the golden rule is beside the point. The golden rule does objectively exist.
Some people absolutely hate life every single day, and have to be committed, so they're not going to take their own life. So I would say that that's not an objectively shared fact at all. The way things are means objective fact. Well, I would say that's true, but it's very subjective on the individual, right? Like, so if I'm perceiving reality, then the knowledge that I have would be true fact, but that's based upon my subjective perception. So when it comes to rape is always wrong, but John is absolutely right. And I do believe we have evidence of this, like archaeological dig.
He does not have evidence in archaeological digs from 100,000 years ago. I'm sorry, that just isn't something that's there. We have very little evidence historically past 10,000 years.
We pretty much, we have a much clearer picture of what we used to call prehistory than we do now. I couldn't cite you anything, but I'm sure that we do have remnants of our archaic.
This is a faith position, by the way. When you have no evidence, but you're sure we have evidence, even though you can't cite anything, and we have no evidence. But that's okay. We'll keep going.
Past, if you do subscribe to the evolution model, I believe that there's actual physical evidence out there. That catches me up. I'll back out. I just wanted to kind of get caught up into the conversation before it left me completely behind.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and just, hey, we're on your channel, man. If you feel like you're being left out again, just jump
Well,
right
no,
in.
it's my own doing. I'm sitting here being quiet, listening. I've been taking a few notes. I wanted to catch up. I never really stated my position. My position that there are objective facts, and those objective facts are very subjective. That's my opinion.
So, well, I think one of the things that I was trying to clarify before was the distinction between whether something exists and, I mean, it wasn't a question of, like, for example, the golden rule exists. It doesn't matter if you want to try to improve upon the golden rule, or if you understand the golden rule, or if you follow it. The golden rule itself exists. And so that's the question. It's an ontological question. It's not an epistemological question. So it's not how you come to know it. That's epistemology. It's whether or not something exists. And so that's the big key here. And I'll turn it over to you guys.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure why that's probative that it exists. I mean, many things exist. I mean, the golden rule, as I understand it, do unto others as, treat others as you would have them treat you. And I understand what Nokasuchi is saying. Okay, and here's an out there kind of example. What if I'm someone who's into S&M? Should I treat strangers the way that I would like to be treated?
Well, yeah.
And on that note, I'm going to go to another part of the conversation. So I think that this is where it gets a little carried away for a few minutes. I'm going to put the link to the full video in here so you guys can go over to the full video and watch the whole thing if you're interested.
If we are morally progressing, how is it that we have had such a lack of regard for the sanctity of life that we have slaughtered in massive numbers, just like they're candy, just getting rid of them? Get rid of these people, get rid of those people. I'd throw a portion on there. I personally don't.
He's referring to the 20th century and some of the real devastation that we've had at the hands of the communists in the USSR, Cambodia, and China. And of course, the synagogue also brought up the events of World War I, World War II, some of the wars under Saddam Hussein and others. And we had a lot of slaughter in the last century. Over 120 million people perished at the hands of the communists who just happened to be atheists. And of course, when you bring that up, people say, well, it wasn't due to their atheism. No, communism is a real egregious system. It's a system where you're taking from everybody who's working and giving to someone else, giving to the powerful. It's a shift from the business person in power to the government. It's handing over power to run your business and to run all businesses to the government. And it's also taking a look at this idea of collectivism. And collectivism is, again, saying for the greater good. The problem with communism, and the reason why any business professor worth his or her salt would laugh any Marxist out of the business school, is because, and that's a Marxist professor, I should say. I'm not going to laugh the Marxist students, because I would just probably just want to make sure they get proper education so they can understand how people were treated and how they perished and they starved to death under the system of communism in these countries I just mentioned. And so what I want to mention with the reason why they would be laughed is because, number one, we have innate within us this desire to work hard. Some of us do. And we think that if we do work hard, we're going to be rewarded. There's a theory called expectancy theory that speaks quite well to this. So we work very hard. We want to be rewarded. The communists have this idea that everyone's going to put in a bunch of work, but they're all going to distribute the outcomes equally. It's equality of outcomes. So I could work really hard and my neighbor might not do anything, and we're both going to receive the same level of pay. Very low level of pay, starvation level of pay. But that's the kind of system that the communists want to run. It's completely egregious. It's satanic. If you go back and you look around 1963, you're going to see some of the communist ideas that they had, how they wanted to ruin the world. They wanted to break up family units. They wanted to put really ugly art out there. They wanted to endorse things like prostitution. And we can see that some of the goals that they had from the 60s have been coming true today. They have broken a lot of things up. John Peterson posited that we have sort of a progressive morality, and our morality is improved. Well, I can't say that is for sure. In the wake of communism, I'm thinking, and looking over at North Korea, I can say that we still have a lot of room to go. What we're trying to do is we're trying to get to the goalpost that God sent. And through Jesus Christ, as God's moral exemplar, we can see what the standard of perfection looks like. So let me go.
don't think that we've
You know what I mean?
progressed all
Like,
that far.
I don't.
19th and 20th centuries, we have killed more people.
Okay,
Then-
but again, what does it have to do with a moral framework? You're mentioning immorality. Well, we could just throw the same thing back on you. You
Yeah.
claim there's a subjective moral standard out there.
No,
Why
it's
isn't
not. It's not
why isn't
necessarily
that
what,
working to stop the things that you're bringing up?
It's not. This particular claim I'm making is not necessarily about your claim about where the morality originated. I have a separate argument for that. I'm talking about the claim of moral progression. I think that's clearly, and which is an argument that you used to indicate that
Well, no, it's
perhaps
not
that
an
it comes
argument
from.
that I used. SJ asked me a question when I got done. She said, "Do I believe that things have gotten better over time, moralistically speaking?" And I agreed with that statement. I mean, and if you look over the entirety of human history, certainly as a society, I'm talking about the whole planet, as human beings, our moral frameworks are better now than they were centuries ago. I mean, even in the last century, there was things that happened that you're bringing up that aren't happening now. Just in the last couple of decades, treatment of women, treatment of marginalized groups. We've had a shift in the moral viewpoint of how to treat folks like that. Not everybody's there yet. But
let me pipe in on that, because I have to say, since the 1970s in the United States, we've lost 1 million innocent lives every single year due to abortion. Okay. And in places like Iceland, they've decided that, guess what? We don't want to have anyone with Down syndrome in our population. So if you have Down syndrome is diagnosed in the womb, you have to abort that baby. And I think that's downright sick. I don't think that's an improvement at all in moral values. I think that's a horrible depravity.
Well, I mean, yeah, I would agree with you on that. I don't think that a government should be saying if you have this type of pregnancy, you shouldn't bring it to term. But you can't outlaw abortion. I mean, how would you? Well, how could you? You're going to take women's
I
bodies
agree.
away from them?
I agree that abortion is a moral issue. I just don't understand how it's a Christian moral issue.
Well, I mean, to be fair, it's not. The most pro-life activists are speaking from strictly secular perspectives. It just so happens that the majority of Christians are pro-life because they believe the Bible is teaching what would be with a pro-life perspective.
You would agree with me that the abortion conversation isn't a conversation about the objectivity of God, because God clearly doesn't lay out any laws or guidelines when it comes to a fetus, but it is a modern secular modern secular argument about morality.
When do you believe?
I tell you what, though, I would make the claim right now, from my reading of the Bible, that that the God of the Bible is pro-abortion.
Now, if he goes to Jeremiah, he's going to notice a really nice passage that says, "Before you were formed in the womb, I knew you." It's a beautiful passage in reference to God's value for life. Also, if you look at the 10 Commandments, God clearly says not to murder other humans. Let me just say something. So it says the 10 Commandments. One of the commandments is we're not supposed to murder others, and babies are in the womb. That's a life. Okay, I don't consider the baby a non-life up until when it's born, which some atheists have actually argued that a baby is not a baby is not a life until it pops out of the womb. And I think that's completely absurd. And I think the late-term abortions are particularly egregious, but the ones certainly in the early
hardly ever happen. They are hardly ever happen.
They occur, though, John. They do occur. And so
when the life of the mother is at risk,
if the life of the mother is at risk, that's the factor. But there could be other reasons that the mother finds out maybe the baby has a particular birth defect and decides that I'm just going to go ahead and kill the baby. And the problem with the abortion thing is what happened to me when I was pregnant. And I went to a doctor and I actually looked it up. I thought it was at 12 weeks, but it was actually at 15 weeks with a very well-developed son inside me. And they said, it looks like he has this echogenic heart and echogenic bowels. And those are 2 soft markers for Down syndrome. But don't worry, you can terminate the pregnancy. And I was like, are you sick? I'm not going to kill my son. I could see a whole body inside of me that was perfectly little fingers and toes. And I thought that was the sickest thing I'd ever heard. And I think the ease that people feel by pretending that is not a human life, that's just a clump of cells or a termination of a pregnancy, I think that's sick. And you know why people do that is because they know we have an objective moral conscience and value to save the life. And so they rephrase it. They, just like the Jews did during the Holocaust, they said that the Nazis said the Jews were rats because they were trying to depersonalize them. And so the same thing's going on right now with abortion. People are pretending the fetus is it's not a human. And I think that's disgusting.
Well, here, just to answer it real quick, I don't pretend that at all. I think it's a human life at the moment of conception. And once it's conceived and once it attaches to the uterine wall, as far as I'm concerned, it's a human being. But that's not the issue. Women have to have bodily autonomy. This life is growing in another human body. Mm-hmm. Okay, and there is inherent risks, as you know, you're a mother yourself. There's inherent risks in bringing a fetus to term, and we can't, as a society, point a finger at women and say you must carry your child to term. I mean, how can you do that in a free society? How
in a free society can you tell two people you must raise this child for the next 18 years, dedicating 40 plus hours a week to this child? I mean, why not? Like, honestly, if you've already agreed that it's a human life,
society doesn't do that.
What's different between shooting the 3-year-old?
Well, society doesn't say you must raise this child. We do have things like abortion,
or adoption.
When the 3-year-old is alive,
adoption. That's what I mean.
It does, right? That's a law.
But you might want to remember Steve Jobs was adopted, and look how he changed the world. So if you're in the position where you're listening to this right now, and you're thinking that you would have an abortion, or you've got a baby inside of you right now, and you're stressing out about it, just consider adoption.
My point is this:
barring adoption.
I agree that part of the conversation when it comes to abortion is that question: is it a zygote or is it a human being? Is it an embryo or a human being? Sure, that's one of the questions. My point is that comes from your secular morality that you have here in the modern world. You're not deriving that anywhere from the Bible or from anything that you've read about God or God's intentions.
So let me address that.
That would be my point.
And so let me address that too, because I know that is a different point. I would actually say that I think that there is a yes and a no in that conversation. The yes in that conversation is that the issue that is abortion in the modern, political sphere is not a religious issue. Schuyler Fiction is pro-life. Christopher Hitchens was pro-life. There are Christians who are pro-choice. Joe Biden is a Catholic, right? So, clearly this isn't an issue that's just going to be cut down straightforward religiously. It just so happens that the majority of atheists are pro-choice and the majority of, serious evangelical Christians are pro-life.
Because their preachers have made this their preachers have made this a religious issue. They play upon their secular morality to make this a religious issue.
See, I think that's where the no comes in, because there's nothing that says thou shalt not commit abortion in the Bible. It is found in the Didache, interestingly enough, but the Didache is not scripture.
And there is that verse to use the dust of the temple for certain instances. And we all know, innocent, during the flood, obviously pregnant women died during the flood, right? I mean, we know this happened.
But so there's some separation you got to make there, right? Obviously, you have to understand God is the arbiter of life and death. Is not,
that's an apologetic. That's an apologetic.
No, it's not an apologetic. It is the absolute fact.
Well,
look, again, if here's the thing. Hold on. Here's the thing. Okay, I know you want to talk objectively. I know that it is objectively wrong to drown a child or to drown a pregnant woman, and thereby drown her fetus. Okay, and God did that. He according to the Bible, I mean, God, when I say God did that, I don't believe that God did that because I don't believe God exists. But according to your Bible, God decided he was going to hit the reset switch. And instead of using his omnipotence to, as some people put it, relocate those souls to heaven, he decided, let's drown all of them. Let's make them all go through the suffering of drowning, to bring them home to God.
One of the big issues that a lot of people, like the atheists, like to do is they like to go into the Bible and pull Bible verses out of context from the Old Testament. And the challenge with that is because when you don't understand the cultural context and you don't understand the way that the people were living back at that time, you're trying to equivocate what happened then with what happens now. And so what we do know about the ancient past, and we do know about groups such as the Canaanites, is they were living pretty disgusting lifestyles. So the Canaanites placed a lot of value on their crops, much more so than they placed on other people. The Canaanites did not value their children much at all. And so if they wanted better crops, they thought that they could sacrifice their children up to 4 years old, quite commonly, to the gods. And so many of them would put them in the god Baal or Molech. They had these like bulls where they had this god that was in this kind of horrible looking beastie sort of body, and he was holding a bull, and they would burn their children in the bull, and the children would start shriveling. Now, ancient writers have documented this, so it's not just the Bible that has documented this, but the baby would start shriveling in the bull, and its little body would start shriveling, and they would be playing music really loud so people couldn't hear the babies howling. And the other kinds of things people like the Canaanites were doing is they were engaging in prostitution inside of their temples as they worshiped to gods, and the gods they worshiped also were committing acts of things like bestiality and prostitution and incest and all sorts of other pretty good, disgusting things. So in God's great mercy, he decided at some point that he's got to end a lot of this. And so what he did in some of these different situations with some of these ancient societies, he did put an end to those societies. He did not want them to continue. And in his mercy, he wanted those kids to go right to heaven rather than have to experience that sort of egregious lifestyle or be sacrificed. So on that note, I'm just going to say goodbye. I hope you guys all liked, and will subscribe. Please come again. And I'm going to link the full video here in the description, so you can go down there and listen to the whole thing. It got a little heated at times, but it was a lot of fun. So thank you so much, and have a great one. So whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do it all for the glory of God.